Hi everyone. American passenger trains. They've had good times and bad times since their inception. Unfortunately, in recent decades, most of them have been bad. The trains of a country's intercity rail carrier, Amtrak, tend to be slow, infrequent, and plagued by severe delays. They're also increasingly decrepit, at least out west. To make matters worse, Amtrak lacks a source of dedicated funding, and the future of its busiest rail corridor, the Northeast Corridor, or NEC, is in doubt. Ever since it was taken over by Amtrak, the NEC has suffered from insufficient maintenance. To bring it up to a state of good repair would cost approximately $38 billion. To tell the truth, I'm kind of surprised the NEC has remained functional until now. I guess I shouldn't be too pessimistic, seeing as how politicians and journalists have been predicting the NEC's imminent collapse since 1987. But in the past 10 years, there's been mounting evidence, mainly in the form of multiple power outages and derailments, that the corridor's collapse may in fact be close at hand. These problems can only be solved with enough support from Congress. But there isn't enough such support. That's partly because Amtrak is expected to fulfill two conflicting missions: to provide a public service and to be profitable. But it's also because the great majority of the Republican Party is opposed to passenger trains. And this leads me to the question I want to ask today. What does the Republican Party have against passenger rail? The most obvious potential issue is money. Amtrak was founded in 1971. In nearly 50 years of existence, it has never been self-sufficient. It's always required taxpayer money to survive. In fiscal year 2018, for example, it lost $817 million and received about $1.8 billion in federal subsidies. It claims that it'll make a profit in 2020, but that's only true if you engage in a lot of creative accounting. Republicans aren't happy with the situation, not happy at all. They feel that Amtrak shouldn't be mooching off taxpayers. Not a year since 1971 has gone by without them denouncing Amtrak as a symbol of government waste and proposing solutions for eliminating or at least reducing the subsidies. Some of these solutions are half-baked, others deserve closer consideration, but none of them have been approved. But where I get confused is that other forms of American public transportation require subsidies too. They just don't require as much of them. For instance, as of 2012, the per passenger mile subsidy was about 2 cents for airlines and 0.8 cents for intercity buses. The equivalent subsidy for Amtrak was approximately 21 cents. But to judge by their dealings with Amtrak, Republicans seem to be opposed to the very idea of subsidizing public transportation. Well, by that logic, we should be opposing subsidies for airlines and buses too. Strangely, I don't think any congressional representative has ever picked up on this inconsistency. If any congressional representatives are out there listening, please feel free to chime in the comment section. But maybe Republicans have a different problem with Amtrak. Maybe they don't like big government. Amtrak being subsidized and owned by the federal government definitely qualifies as a symbol of big government. And the idea that Republicans don't like big government has some truth to it. They have a fairly consistent track record of being against government-funded programs. Their rationale is that such programs are less efficient and not as free as the free market. And we've seen their philosophy at work in recent years. Since 2008, Republicans have proposed privatizing the NEC at least 5 times. And they focused on the NEC because it's by far Amtrak's busiest rail line, and they think it loses much less money than other lines. They claim that if their vision sees the light of day, they could further reduce the burden on the taxpayer. They could significantly reduce the burden on the taxpayer and possibly even turn the NEC into a cash cow. Now, privatization is not an inherently bad idea. If you look at Japan, it privatized its railway network in 1987. Since then, fare increases have stayed low, railway companies have required no operating subsidies, and the punctuality rate has remained consistent at just under 95%, at least on the island of Kyushu. I haven't been able to find statistics for the rest of Japan. True, Japanese high-speed trains are incredibly expensive, but they travel at much faster speeds than their American counterparts. They're much better value for money. To achieve these results, the Japanese have had to do three things: operate real estate business, give one company ownership of both infrastructure and trains, and assume a majority of the debt of the national railway company. Are these lessons applicable in the US? It's very difficult to say because there's no precedent for Americans attempting to integrate ownership of infrastructure and trains or assuming a national railway company's debt. And I think that the $38 billion maintenance backlog on the NEC definitely counts as a debt. Republicans haven't explained in detail how these things could happen. Until they come forward with detailed proposals, we have a right to be skeptical. So that's the second possible reason behind Republican opposition of passenger rail. The third reason is that Amtrak mainly benefits Democratic states. You can't deny that a disproportionate share of Amtrak's passengers come from the NEC states, and to a lesser extent, from Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, California, Washington, and Oregon. In 2018, these states accounted for more than 64% of Amtrak's ridership. And since the 1990s, they belonged overwhelmingly to the Democrats. Apart from Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, that is. If you want to use Amtrak in any other part of the country, you can expect infrequent service in the neighborhood of one train a day, a punctuality rate averaging 48%, and trains that travel much more slowly than cars or buses. I can't really think of anything unsound about this motivation. It's understandable that Republicans wouldn't want their constituents funding a service that doesn't really benefit them. So those are three possible reasons for the GOP's opposition of passenger rail. Are they compelling? And do they strike a chord with Republicans? I think we can rule out the constituent reason, because it didn't exist in the 1970s and 1980s, and the Republicans never seemed to allude to it, at least as far as I know. For the free market cause, the Republicans have shown a clear interest in privatizing the NEC, but they haven't proposed any detailed plans for privatization. And they're approaching their ambition with a very unrealistic mindset. As for the last reason, the debate over subsidies, well, the Republicans have alluded to it plenty of times. And I think that here Amtrak is burdened by unrealistic expectations. When it was founded in 1971, Secretary of Transportation John Volpe stated that Amtrak could be profitable within perhaps 3 years, provided it received sufficient federal capital funding and eliminated unsuccessful routes. It seems the Republicans have forgotten the first condition of his prediction. Amtrak has only received starvation-level capital funding, and that's why the NEC is in such a mess. And with that said, what Congress really ought to do is ask itself whether the condition has been met. Until that happens, the Republican war against Amtrak will probably continue, and the casualties will be people trying to travel around by train.